Hey everybody, Grant Sims here at Chief River, talking security, talking OAuth at the command line or with command line utilities. When we typically talk about OAuth and more the modern flows, it requires a browser to perform parts of the flows there, especially in the authorization code flow. So with that, when we're at the CLI, we're using CLI utilities. How do we perform those flows with and without a browser? So today I'm going to kind of walk you through kind of the more legacy way of going about that using the resource owner flow, and then how you see and how you might have interacted with other command line utilities that are using the authorization code flow in a more modern fashion and using a browser as well. So let's just jump right into this. And then just to let you know at the end, I will follow this up and actually show how this is working via packet captures, etc. So let's look at the command line OAuth flow for resource owner. Resource owner, there's a couple things to note here. You will be providing the client the username and password to do the authentication. So, that's kind of the downside here. Also, you're not going to be able to utilize MFA because of that fashion. So let's just walk through the flow here so you can get a gist of what that means. The user pulls up a CLI tool. They need to log in. That prompts them for their username and password. They type that directly into the client and user agent there, which is the command line. It's going to send those then via an API request to your auth server to authenticate you, and then if so, return you some tokens, which you can then send down to your resources as you perform. So like I said, the downsides here: we are providing our username and password to the client, and we can't do MFA because of this inline passing of the password. Doesn't really get us too many security benefits, but it could help us centralize identities. Now, let's look at what we might notice with more of the modern command line tools and really what's going on here. Remember, we need a browser, so a browser is going to play a part here. In this use case, what we're going to have is a user that goes to their CLI, starts their utility, and then typically there's a command to initiate a login. And we're going to use the Azure in CLI in this example and in the demo later. But they're going to type AZ login. And what that's actually going to do is it's going to do two things. In the client CLI, that utility, it's going to open a browser for them. And it's going to craft the URL for that browser to go to the endpoint that is starting the authorization code flow. What the user will see is a prompt for their username and password directly to their IDP, directly to their auth server. So this is the first benefit. We're no longer having our client, our utility, know anything about our password. We're opening up another client, which in this case is a browser. We're formulating a URL that starts the authorization code flow, and we're interacting directly with what we know is our IDP, is our authorization server. So we're happy to pass these credentials to this trusted entity. The other thing is, because we're interacting with our authorization server, we can do whatever it's configured to do as far as authentication. So we can configure it for MFA. Now, what's going on under the hood here? How do we get the information back from our auth server to our CLI utility? So actually, at the same time that it's opening up a client browser for you and asking you for your credentials, etc., it's also spinning up a temporary TCP listener here on your local host. When this application is configured within your auth server, it has a URL called a callback URL. And in that callback URL, it is defined to send it to a certain endpoint after the authentication is successful. In this case, it's going to be sending it to this local TCP listener. So the user comes to its IDP, they authenticate, do whatever authentication requires, including MFA. That authorization code is returned to the client browser, and then the client browser performs the redirect to the TCP listener port. Here, the CLI then can actually grasp that information that's returned and then use that to programmatically finish the authorization code flow, sending that information back to the auth server, interacting with it, and then if successful, providing tokens to the CLI client. So hopefully you got that, but let's take this and actually look at it and see how it's working underneath the hood. All right, so what I first want to do is just show you kind of a current state of what's listening on our host here. Nothing related to the demo, just showing you, kind of a clean slate here. We're also going to start our packet capture on our loopback interface. And now let's go ahead and start the login process with Azure Login. All right, you can see our browser popped up. You can see that it has crafted a specific authorization code flow URL to start performing that flow in our browser. It's asking me to log in. Before we do that, let's just pop over here now and let's go back to our listeners. Let's see what's going on here. You can see a new listener via Python is stood up here. This is part of that, waiting to receive the callback after our authentication. So now let's go back over here, make sure our packet capture is running. Yep. Let's go back over to our browser. Let's perform authentication. We're logging in. Okay, you can see it's successful. You can see that it has redirected us back to our local host and provided the authorization opaque token here as far as code flow. You can see the session state, client information as well. We'll look at that in the packet capture. So we're in successfully. If we look over here, we can now go back. You can see that the Azure CLI tore down that Python listener now, so it's no longer listening. We are authenticated. You can see our cloud information over here. And now let's go look at our packet capture. So if we come up here and we look at this packet right here, you can see that we did capture that redirect and we have everything needed, or I should say the CLI now has everything it has needed to continue with the authorization code flow and get the tokens. You can see here we have the authorization code flow. We have the client information, which is base64, a state and a session state. And with that, like I said, you can continue the authorization code flow, grab tokens, and then interact with resources as depicted here in the diagram. So hopefully, that gave you a good understanding of what's happening under the hood with these modern CLI tools and how they're utilizing the browser to perform more modern OAuth flows like the authorization code flow. If you have any questions, thoughts, or if you like the video, please press the like button and subscribe, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much.